All right, we're live, waiting for people to join. All right, welcome to everybody who's joined. We're gonna spin it up now. Just trying to work out the technical details. I want to make sure everybody can see. All right, so I'm Ben Watson, CEO at Hawkin Dynamics. We've got Eric Renaghan, St. Louis Blues, Daniel Hicker, San Jose Earthquakes here.
Hey guys.
What's up, everyone?
So it's going to be a pretty quick presentation, but today we want to focus on question and answer, get some feedback from the attendees. Hopefully that can drive some of the conversation. We're waiting on Jason Lake, potentially Peter Mundy as well. Just FYI, they are running late, assuming it's related to UK time. But with that, we'll just jump right into it. So today, what we want to talk about primarily are some of the basic applications of force plates in the team setting. Pretty simple stuff, but a lot that can be discussed. So there's 3 core applications. This information is from my own experience working with a couple hundred teams over the last few years. Standard is athlete monitoring, looking at change over time, fatigue monitoring, another very common usage. Second big one is the return to play monitoring testing, looking at return to sport, sort of what that involves, different protocols. And then the last, and I would say the most advanced, more complex, will be programming your athlete training using force profiling. So using force plate data to determine what exercises, what programs your athletes are going to be doing. So to start, I'm just going to go through athlete monitoring pretty quickly. It's pretty basic, it's pretty standard, but still sometimes it can help to reinforce some core points. So when we talk about athlete monitoring, I think the key, and this kind of follows on what we talked about last week and the week before, is consistency. So you want to have a standardized protocol. You want to be consistent with it. You want to ensure that you're getting the same data every time that you test. These are really kind of basic concepts, but I really like to hammer them home because this is the type of thing that can kind of make or break your testing program. If you don't standardize the testing in terms of pre or post practice, pre or post game, can be that much harder to establish a solid program and obviously to start looking at that data over time. So that's really one of the key features of this type of testing is you need some way to look at the data over time. Obviously in our software, we have the ability to do that built in. However, not everybody has that capability. So what a lot of folks do with different softwares, with different force plate data, use Excel, things like that, graphing things longitudinally, rather than simply looking at a moment in time. So I think that's really a key feature. In this instance, what I'm looking at here on this little report snippet is this is my own data, looking at basically a 6-week period. Jump height has gone up on average over that period. The breaking phase time, another metric I'm looking at here, has also increased. And so, breaking phase time being what it is, there's something going on there with me, whereas I'm essentially getting a bigger range of motion. I'm dropping a little bit lower, trying to utilize more of a stretch shortening cycle. And the end result is that over time, my jump height is going up. Now, obviously, those are only 2 metrics. I could look at a lot more things over time. And some people have kind of their favorite things to look at. Jason, who just joined, can attest to that. He likes to keep things very simple, which I definitely agree with. But in this case, I just wanted to show a really simple example of how I can look at change over time. So for example, if this was a 6-week training program, okay, I'm seeing jump height increase. So that's a good thing. And then we can start to add layers as to why maybe that is changing over time. Obviously, there's one outlier test down here I should have deleted, but another common application for athlete monitoring is readiness testing. We have some really good examples of this with some of our users who test regularly pre-game, post-game, pre-practice, and essentially they're able to look at that data in real time to determine whether or not an athlete is ready to train on a given day or ready to play. And I think that is something we're building into our software in the near future. We already have a readiness report, but it was in beta, so we're still playing with that. I think the key with any of this stuff is really keeping things simple. It's also a big challenge because it can get very complicated when you start looking at different things. There's considerations for is a higher value for a particular metric better or not? So that's one of the things that we're sort of toying with now, trying to figure out what's the best way to display this information so that it makes sense and that it's also just quickly accessible. So Drake, who just joined, is one on our team, and he, working in college basketball, has done a really good job with readiness testing. He's got some really good information about that. Also, preseason, really obvious time. Athletes come in. This also applies probably to what's going on right now, given that everybody's out, nobody's really actively training in the team setting. So to be able to actually monitor progress, how quickly certain athletes are getting back into shape once things return to normal in the next, who knows when, a lot of that stuff's going to apply as well. So the key with athlete monitoring and force plates is obviously regular testing, having some way to measure change over time to reflect that change visually, something very simple. I know that Daniel and Eric are both going to discuss how to communicate or a little bit about how this information can be used to communicate within a team setting. And I think that's a really core point. The data is only as valuable as your ability to communicate it, right? So everybody's seen overly complex spreadsheets, and we've been guilty of it in the past where people want certain features that might look cool, but if you can't communicate the information effectively and concisely, your head coach, your athletic trainer, your fellow strength coaches probably aren't going to really use that information. So from a technology standpoint, there's lots of different systems out there, but from what we're trying to do is make that stuff as foolproof as we possibly can. That's obviously a pretty big task, but we've also done some stuff in the past, testing teams preseason and then doing some comparative reports throughout the preseason as they come back, especially in like NFL. That's an example where people come in for OTAs in April. They're not usually in great shape. Some are, but to be able to see the change over an 8-week period of time is pretty amazing. And then be able to actually objectively measure that is really a game changer. Another piece of athlete monitoring I like to talk about a lot of times with our users is this idea of using the testing and using sort of the idea behind it is to build sort of a culture around it. And part of that culture is obviously keeping athletes accountable. It's not, a way of punishing athletes who aren't maybe performing at the highest level, but it also allows you to communicate as a coach with those athletes about, what things that you're seeing visually, and then you can actually back that up with objective data. And I think that's really the key. Sets and reps are one thing, but the issue when somebody's performing a rep, you're only seeing the result, right? Did they get the weight off their chest? Did they get off the ground? That kind of thing. And it's not quite as objective. Obviously, every coach has a good eye. You know your athletes. It can just be really helpful if you have some solid numbers that are objective, that are valid to back up what you're seeing. Another big piece on this is this culture of accountability idea is that communicating with the athletes themselves can also be really enhanced if you're able to provide visual data to show their progress over time, to show that, hey, your data's, your jump height, whatever metrics you're using. I think that's kind of irrelevant. You're improving, so you feel like you're getting better, you feel like you're getting faster, you feel like you're jumping higher, you feel like you're getting stronger throughout a training program. And look, we've got the data to back that up. That's really essential. Eric can probably talk to that because I know he's really strong in that area and really kind of communicating what he knows to his athletes. Another piece I wanted to mention is the idea that you can drive competition among the athletes if you kind of make it almost gamify the testing. It's something a lot of our users do. We hear it all the time. We see it all the time as well. this is a scoreboard we have on our web app. I know a lot of other systems have something comparable, but what's nice about this scoreboard is you can set a target for somebody, right? So we did an event for the NFLPA a couple months back, and the amount of interaction with the athletes when they actually saw their data up on the screen was amazing, and it really allowed us to ensure that we were getting max effort. You know, it kind of goes without saying, if you're not getting max effort tests and data from your athletes, it's not all that useful. Yeah, that really helped. People were pretty fired up, you know, just kind of feed into that competitive spirit that all elite athletes should have, hopefully. The key, standardize your testing again. And again, you know, I really like to talk about the communication with the athletes because I just think it's so useful if done correctly. It's also why I think Jason's points in the previous webinars, some of the stuff we talked about is so important as well. Keep things simple, right? You know, if you start creating, you know, tertiary metrics where you're dividing everything by something else to get a rate of a rate of a rate, how does that help anybody, right? Keep things simple, keep it in the context you can explain to them. And also to your fellow coaches. I mean, it kind of sounds straightforward, but you'd be surprised how often we see it. You know, we hear it from folks, hey, is this the right metric to use? Is this the right metric to use? If you don't understand and you know, if you don't own the data, as Jason says, you know, you're going to have a hard time communicating that to an athlete, GM, you know, assistant athletic director, whatever the case may be. So the next one is going to be return to sport. Daniel, who has put in really nice amount of effort on this presentation. He's going to take over now. I'm going to be quiet for a couple of minutes, hopefully. And then again, we're going to reserve the end for questions. Probably have about 20-25 minutes or so to answer some questions. There is a Q&A feature on the meeting, or on, yeah, it looks like there's already one question. So we learned obviously from our first couple webinars that we're going to hold off for questions at the end. So I'm going to pass off the mic to Daniel. Daniel, just give me a signal when it's time to advance the PowerPoint.
Good. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I think I saw my jump on that last slide. I need some work to do. I don't know when you put that up, but a little bit better than that. I can be a little bit better than that. Oh, that one. There's a Dan H as well.
Oh yeah, that's definitely you. Oh, you're not up in the 50s yet.
I'll do some work.
Because right. at a
next
conference.
Next slide. Perfect. So yeah, I'm gonna try to keep this short, sharp, and sweet. Obviously, everybody has their own example of how they make things work. This is a sort of the sight and sounds of myself, and I guess where I work, how we all work together. There's a lot of pieces, a lot of parts. It's just a snapshot of ongoing communications. And I would say this is also ideal. Every place is a little bit different, and I don't think everything everywhere moves as smoothly as we'd like, but this is a support group, right? So it's all interlinked. There's specialization without separation, and we try to share a common thread of how we want to make things happen. Realistic expectations, resources sometimes limit us, sometimes they help us, the access to, and then we're also looking at the schedule that we want to work with. But I'll let you guys dissect this a little bit more, but as you can tell, it works from the top down. I mean, we try to keep everybody involved, and sometimes there's, you know, it's pretty smooth. Sometimes there's arguments and negotiations, but at the end of it, we're all in a healthy place. Next slide. Cool. So this is just an example. We'll call this athlete A. In my realm, our realm, we're working from pro athletes all the way down to the youth, the academy. So really, in general, I think we're all long-term athletic development, cradle to grave. And in this case, this is a youth athlete. So before I even dissect this, as we all know, there's so much going on in those stages of development. You know, really, we want to focus on the movement. We want to focus on them getting, you know, stronger, how they're managing forces. Can they apply load, manage load really well? And the force plate's been great for us to be able to see that. First and foremost, if we can develop a culture where the athlete has a lot of intent behind it, and I think that we're working on developing that a lot. So for this athlete, I just marked it 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 is before the injury. 2 is after the injury when they were coming back and to return to sport. And there's a little bit of work, obviously, before that, just making sure that they can load up that leg. It was we had a fracture of the distal tibia of the left ankle. So you can tell right away that there's a difference in the trace, as Ben has helped me out right here. And the biggest difference is they're just not feeling confident. They're just not, they lost some strength. They're not moving as well as we'd like them to see. The impulse has changed a lot, and this is obviously normal. When we go to part three is just looking at some notes here, is about, we're looking at about 4 months after. So, really they're starting to feel more confident, but the impulse is a little bit different. And the picture in here, there's a picture that I did not put in here that shows when the athlete is starting to, we're asking them to try to apply more force and jump more aggressively, and we see just a mess. So we wanted to pick something out here where we could see that we're starting to get a good trace, and we're starting to get back to norm. And even if you look at 1, you start to see some patterning that's coming along. If you look at 4 is, so I guess I should back up a little bit. 2 is when we first started to come back in. 3 is when we started to load up again and the athlete is starting to train a bit. 4 is when they're full training, and we're starting to see some changes in the movement pattern as well as the impulse. It's looking very similar to picture 1 before the break happened. We're also seeing some changes to the landing pattern. So we hope that we were able to come in and correct that a little bit, where the athlete is able to absorb and feel a little bit better about their landing, a little bit more equally. But I'd like to point out that in 4, although the impulse may look the same, you can see a little bit of a difference in the braking. So it's a little, I wouldn't say too noisy, I wouldn't say too noisy, but it's not clean. It's a little bit too sharp. So there's something going on there with their jump strategy. And it's not bad, but we want to make sure that we mark that. And again, putting emphasis on, this is after the athlete has been training. So it's really hard to get the same type of intensity in the gym or on the field if you're working with the athlete on the side. Even once you start putting them back into play, then you start to see some real changes. You can try to get them as even as possible, just like picture 3, but then as soon as they go out and start playing, you're going to start to see some changes. You can get them as symmetrical as possible, but you're going to see some asymmetries when you start getting out there again, which is what we want to see, because that's obviously sport. So 4 is also the last jump before, as you know, we're all kind of suspended right now. So before we went into our league suspension, this is kind of where we are. So we get a good place to, a good baseline for when we come back. We kind of assess where things are. Next slide, please. This next piece is, so one of the things we did just to kind of assess confidence, but just looking at loader mannerism. So loading mannerism. So if you're looking at this is basically a 40 pound dumbbell that the athlete is squatting with. And the first one is when they come back. So picture 1 is when they're coming back from the injury. And the thing that we wanted to look at the most is the trace. So you can see obvious difference between the left and the right. And I think a lot of this is obviously coming from strength, perhaps loss, but also just confidence in the movement. One of the things also is, if you look at the mechanics, look very similar to a counter movement jump. It's not the same, obviously, they're not leaving the plane. But then when you look at the reset, so when they're descending, ascending, and then kind of resetting before they go again, you're starting to see a difference in that when you go to 2. So the trace and the regular squatting is starting to look very similar, right versus left. But then in the reset, and again, a lot of terms you can throw out there, I'm just saying reset, you see a difference there. So they're obviously favoring one side a little bit more than the other. As we progress, so picture 3, that part is looking a little bit different. So we're starting to feel a little bit more confident in if they were to jump, or how they're jumping and how they're going to land. and then moving into 4, that's sort of the last free run that we did, which by the way, this is on the free run. Last free run that we did, where we felt like it was a good show that the athlete was in a good spot, and this was right around the time that we marked, hey, you know, they could probably go out in their play. Let's monitor them after that point. Next slide, please. This is just a comparison report. So again, information can be powerful, and of course, the slides before were just kind of points that we could mark, and we could talk to a coach or the athlete, I think, first and foremost, but then also our support staff. And the first part, value A, was really just some points approximately 6 weeks before the break. And then value B is about approximately 6 weeks after, so leading up to that 6-week mark. And this, one of the notes is that there's, you know, we're right back to a pretty good baseline. The braking might be a little bit better, actually, which is good. But then when you come down to the left versus right, the braking versus the impulse, we're seeing a significant change there. So they're moving from the left to the right. I think that the braking is probably okay, but then when you look at the impulse, you're seeing, you know, we don't really know if that's a significant difference or not yet. We need a little bit more time, and we'll see that when we get back into training. But it's a pretty good switch. And is that switch coming because they just feel not confident on that left side, or we've changed their strategy, or they've changed their strategy? So I think that when you look at the impulse, that's obviously an important thing to consider. We've seen the stiffness has changed overall. So there's a lot of that coming from, you know, where they feel confident in moving and what we've applied. Do we need to adjust things? And you know, just kind of continue to monitor from there. So I'll leave that up. Obviously, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them at the end.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing as well. Thank you, Daniel. That was awesome. I've looked at a lot of traces like this, as Jason probably has too, as Eric and Daniel both have. Sometimes I've noticed with certain types of lower limb injuries, the asymmetry can be a little bit misleading, because sometimes what you find is a higher stiffness in an injured limb actually results sometimes in them applying more force through that limb during certain movements. I think these being loaded squats is a little bit different, but just in body weight squats, which I know some of our PT users use as sort of a return to play, part of their return to play protocol. I've seen situations where an athlete's injured limb is actually producing more force during an unweighted squat, and my suspicion is it has something to do with an increased stiffness, because they simply don't have the same type of flexion in the knee, or whatever the case may be. That's just an anecdote I wanted to add, because I thought that was interesting that you use the squat data. So we're going to wrap up with Eric's piece here. I'm going to be quiet again.
Yeah, thanks. Just to kind of add on what you just mentioned there, Ben, I think a lot of us have to really pay special attention to the relationship between some of those variables as well, not just the left and right asymmetry when we're returning an athlete to play. I think if we're looking at tracings like the one Daniel posted, it's important for us to understand how the different phases of that movement pattern are I guess, in relation to each other. So I think that's a key to remember, not to go back on that topic. But what I want to talk about today, guys, is a little bit different. Really what I'm going to be focusing on is the start and the kind of the challenges that I've faced with force profiling and adding this type of technology into my setting. And so I think it's important for us to all, really remember that sports performance is pretty random, right? And luck makes things impossible for us to really accurately predict how things are going to turn out for our athletes. And so, I can remember probably on one hand how many times I've really felt like there's a sure thing with an athlete in terms of how they were going to perform. And even then, there was always something, hidden and that came up and caused injury or subpar performances. So, it's important to remember that we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty and hidden information when it comes to not only adding technology to our settings, but really using the data that we're collecting to impact our programs. I think it's tough for me to really have a relevant understanding of every variable that's going on in our athletes' lives. So I have to really try to figure out how to be as efficient as I can in impacting the variables that I do have a grasp of understanding on. So technology and data being as abundant as they are, I think has made human performance increasingly more complex, and for a lot of us, it's become overwhelming. So I think that when we look at for the majority of us, we're looking to reduce injury, improve performance, and we have to be comfortable understanding that negative results like an athlete getting hurt doesn't really make our decisions and how we program for these athletes incorrect, as long as we're allocating all of our resources and thinking about the alternatives to what we would have done differently. So I think it's important that we think about those things before we talk about profiling. So with that said, I think it's important for me to share some of the things that I've used in terms of creating athlete profiles. I think the first thing to consider is the direction we want to go in terms of reaching our organizational goals. I think for some of us that work for teams or universities, we have to consider those, as the primary factor. Private sector especially, we're looking to make sure that we're accomplishing our organizational goals. And then secondly, we have to take in the individuals of the athlete. I think that's often gets overlooked with programming for athletes in the team setting. Especially, we're looking to say, look, we want to make sure these guys get bigger, stronger, faster, but we don't have a lot of consideration towards what the individual of the athlete is. So that, I think those are the two biggest indicators for creating a profile or starting to profile with your athletes, and utilizing Forceplates to do that. For me, I think it's important to understand that we can't look at data as just cold hard facts, because a lot of it's just subject to our personal judgments as performance practitioners and therapists. So I think we have to really use those judgments and our training biases, to make sure that we're creating a holistic approach to developing our model around our performance profiling is what we call it, but utilizing that data to blend our experiences to create a model. So with creating a feedback loop, we want to make sure that we're in a situation that we can blend our judgments, the data that we're able to collect, and the circumstances of our sports to really, first off, make that program for the athlete so that we can start training, and then use that program to decide if our interventions are working by the data that we're collecting. Before we collect data, sometimes we have to make fairly arbitrary decisions about what we're measuring, and it's important to note that those judgments are not a bad thing, but really they're important in how we effectively navigate those decisions about our programming. So I think those are, for me, profiling is creating those goals for the individual and the group, and then taking that and creating some objectives around how we're going to go about identifying what those profiles look like. So for me, the way we started this was looking at our individual players within our different positional groups, and we talked to some people that were much better at statistics than I were, to identify from a game perspective, what do we consider elite in each position. And when we came to a consensus, we had 4 variables per position from a game perspective that identified what our organization valued as elite or successful in that position. So going back into our data, we were able to look at our defensemen, and we were able to look at a lot of different bits of information that we could blend in to our model and see what was the source of why they were elite potentially. And so as we did that, we looked through the data, we looked through years of data, and we were able to come up with what we call a profile or a signature as to what constituted an elite athlete in each position based off of key performance indicators from the sport, and then key performance indicators from a physical perspective and how they were efficiently creating these outputs that we were able to record during off ice and on ice activity. And for those of you that don't know, I work in hockey, so when I talk about ice, that's what I'm referring to. So the way we did that was we started to utilize an objectives and key results model. I think it was a great start for us because it was able to, we were able to fit the technology that we had into our environment pretty seamlessly. One thing that was important for our athletes was to understand, and we were very transparent with them on why we were collecting the information we were collecting. I know that was number one for me to really get that transparency and really provide that opportunity for the athletes to ask questions and to see really what we were collecting and how it was going to impact not only our decision making from a training perspective, but how that information was being shared across the organizational platform. So the first thing that we did was we created these objectives for each athlete. We created objectives from an organizational perspective, and we tried to blend these two things in. What we also did was we created objectives for each person in hockey operations. So, example of that was our organizational objective for our head coach was to win the Stanley Cup. In order to do that, there's going to be 3 or 4 key results that come along with that. And the key results that we identified for that were special teams units needed to rank no lower than 7th for both the power play and the penalty kill. We had to reduce scoring chances from our opposition. And I guess scoring chances, we classified those as grade A scoring chances. And then we needed to generate more forced turnovers. The systems of play that our coach and our coaching staff wanted us to utilize to perform really was physically demanding on our athletes, but more importantly, it's physically demanding on the other team. So generating more forced turnovers through that system of play. For our defense or our D coach, their organizational objective was to give up fewer than 10 A-level scoring chances per game. And in order to do that, we had to increase our loose puck retrievals, increase zone denials, and develop a second puck moving defenseman. So we needed to have 2 attacking defensemen within our group of 6. So I think for looking at these objectives and the key results, we're taking some of the statistical anomalies that we were able to identify as important for each position and blend those into some of the key results and provide some objectives around how to get there. For me and our performance group, our main objective for the organization, from the organization's perspective, was reduce man games lost and improve availability of all of our athletes. So for me, the key results were improving how we monitored fatigue and readiness, individualize our biomarker prescriptions, and individualize our performance prescriptions. And all of that comes back down to not only what the organization wants, but doing that for the individual player as well. So when we come through and we talk about creating these profiles, it's all based off of the objectives and sorry guys, it's all based around the objectives and key results. So if we look at a counter movement jump as an example, for me, each round of testing takes usually around 2 minutes, and I'm talking per player, per person that we're testing that day. Within that 2-minute frame, I have up to 6 or 7 decisions that need to be made during those testing rounds. And after each round of testing, I have to have a concrete result for that athlete as to whether we improved or we didn't. And what that means is that athlete's looking at the program that we did and thinking back, well, I front squatted every single day and I didn't get better here. So we have to be able to get really comfortable with saying, I don't know why that didn't work, but we're going to look back through the data and we're going to look at our programming to identify where we need to make changes. So I think one of the biggest benefits of the objective and key results models allows us to be flexible with and adaptive with our planning. I think we really have to show, that we are developing and that there's some continuous improvement for our athletes to really trust and buy into that. So I think having the objectives and key results encourages rapid and flexible responses to our changes in our environment, and especially with the lack of training density that we are able to get into during the season, we really have to be as efficient with our prescriptions as we can. So going through our data, we talk a lot about the the relationship between the variables, as I mentioned earlier, how those variables are important not only for performance and efficiency within each position, but how those variables impact their health and their resiliency. So we really have a priority for them on those two perspectives of performance. And I think the objectives and key results are great for helping us find practical workarounds and strategies that we can use to get the execution of our decisions and programming interventions to align better with our objectives for the not only the team but the individual. I think if we look at for example, when we make decisions around our programming and we think about an athlete not getting better and or an athlete getting hurt, even though we try to give them the best possible chance of that from not occurring. I look at an example of our team, and we sometimes we'll win a game by one goal and we leave the lineup the same the next game, and then we lose the next game by one goal, and then all of a sudden we change the lineup. And I think if we react based off of the result of what happened with our program or the game, and it's a single circumstance, I don't think we're allowing us to collect enough data to really make a reliable decision on whether what we programmed for that individual worked or not. So objectives and key results is a huge component for that for us. So I think that's probably the most important aspect for profiling for our athletes. And again, we need to make sure that we're factoring in some occasional deception from our athletes, right? We talk to our athletes about recovery and sleep and nutrition all the time, but they're not going to tell us everything that's going on in their lives. So we have to utilize the technology and the data that we have and the data that we built up over time to really sometimes tease out that hidden information and really clear up some of the uncertainty that we're dealing with our athletes. And I think from a communication point of view, it's really provided us with the opportunity to simplify our nomenclature for our movements, for our variables that we're collecting. That's a huge benefit, not only for the athlete, but for the general manager and our coaching staff and other trainers to understand, so that when we talk to an athlete about what our program is doing for them or what we're trying to get out of the program and asking them to do something specifically, that information is spoken to and shared in the same exact manner to our coach and to our general manager. We want to make sure that because we have a common goal, that everybody is aware of what that goal is and that everybody understands the language. So I think, going back to creating a profile for athletes, it all comes back to what's important to the organization and really taking that information and identifying how we can use that to make our athletes better and more effective in those positions. And then generally speaking, we want to make sure that they're healthy and available. So I think from my perspective, we're looking at it from from a little bit wider perspective, and we're able to utilize this technology in multiple ways. And it allows us, like I said, to reduce some of the uncertainty and, uncover some of that hidden information that we're all dealing with athletes. And I think profiling is certainly going to be one of the best ways to do that. So I think hopefully there's a little bit of a starting point for people that might not be doing that yet. But I think once you collect enough data, you have a wide enough database, you're going to be able to make some better decisions. And I think we're going to avoid looking at results, and we're going to look at our decisions to and how those decisions impacted our athletes over the long run. So I think that's kind of, you know, what I wanted to touch on today, and really allow people to understand that for me, that was one of the biggest challenges, and that was the most important component to working with our athletes before I decided what variables we were going to look at and what tests we were going to do, and how often we were going to do those tests, and you know, the different bandwidths within each test that we were collecting. So I think those are, for me, the most important variables to consider.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. Jason, did you want to jump in and add anything to anything that's already been said?
I'll be honest with you, at this particular point, I'm just going to bow down to Eric and Dan, because I don't do this on a day-to-day basis. I just like looking at squiggly lines, whereas these are the guys who are actually earning their money using these things. So thanks for sharing your experiences.
Thanks for comic relief, Jason, as
Anytime.
always. Eric, that's awesome. No, I think you kind of summed up a lot of what we were talking about. I think a lot of times it's easy to fall into the trap of just obsessing over specific numbers and then obsessing over specific variables and metrics. But at the end of the day, if this all kind of goes back to what Jason spoke on last week and the week before, is data ownership, right? So you need to know why you're collecting what you're collecting. Don't just get data for the sake of data. I know that might be encouraged sometimes in the current sort of environment with all of the sports tech that's out there. And I'm saying this as somebody who owns a company that makes sports technology. But I think at the end of the day, if you don't know why you're doing it, and you don't have a plan in place and a framework through which you're going to utilize the information that you collect from this technology, and that goes for force plates, for GPS, for IMUs, for all the different things that are out there, you're going to find yourself with a lot of information and know maybe not the best means to communicate that and actually apply it. So I think that's just something everybody sees. And I know there's a lot of nice, products out there for organizing the information in the same place. And I really like, Eric, what you said, where you brought it back to what's important to the organization, which is wins and losses, right? And it's accountability, right? So how does testing with force plates fit into that larger context? I think that's really important. And obviously Hawkin Dynamics, we're a force plate company, so we love talking about force plates, but at the end of the day, force plates are going to be a part, hopefully, of your program and kind of your testing protocols, but it's not going to be the only thing you're doing by any stretch. And I think, go ahead.
Yep, sorry. I think it's important to point out that for everything that we do, I think you touched on it pretty well there. It's just a piece of the puzzle, and trying to identify the big question that we have is how we can make our athletes better. And for where I sit, I think, our situation is different than even some other NHL teams, right? We're in a situation where we're in the middle of the country, and, teams that are on the coasts, their travel schedule is much different. They might travel 3 time zones and play 7 games in a week, and we may only travel 1 time zone or 2 time zones. And so all of those things that we're experiencing, and with our density of games, the amount of opportunity we have to train, all of those things that we're dealing with, I think is part of the puzzle. And if we can utilize the technology, specifically with the force plates, to make our impact our decision making in a more effective and more efficient way, I think then we're going to get we're going to have, in the long run, better results than if we're guessing. So I think that's for me a big component to how it's fit in and played a part in our success. I really believe.
Awesome. We got some questions coming up. If anybody has questions, please feel free to use the Q&A section. I see Scott asked a question on the chat. If you can put that in the Q&A, everybody can then all of us can see it, and we can kind of go through them one by one. So that's what we're going to do now. Please don't hesitate. I see Kevin Cronin is making a reference to area code 408. I'm assuming that's in the Bay. All 3 of you guys are from that area. So that's great. Thanks, Kevin. That was awesome. Just kidding. So Joe is asking, Daniel, in terms of evaluating the return performance in your force time curve, for me, I struggle looking at this graph and being able to say X needs to improve, etc. How do you guys go about evaluating the data you have collected. So one of the things that we don't want to do is we don't want to get too in the weeds on like very specific force time curves scenarios, but I think generally this falls in with what we've been talking about, where we're looking both at the output of the test, right? So in the case of a counter movement jump or a loaded squat or whatever it is, you're looking at a few key performance indicators, i.e. jump height, i.e. Power or something like that, but not peak power, as Jason reminds me. But then when we start digging into the force trace, what we're starting to get into is then how they got to that result, right? So that's, you can go a lot of different ways with that. And Daniel, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but I think the bottom line is, and everybody's kind of touched on this, is that it's really about getting consistency in the data collection. The thing with our system, the way that our software is built, because this is the feedback we got from everybody, was you need to be able to display the data over time. You need to be able to see changes over time and actually be able to visualize those things. And so for us, that's really what we try to build. We're really just trying to build a tool that coaches can plug right into and start making sense with it. So, I mean, I could make some comments about example one here about the bizarre unweighting phase on the right limb for this athlete. But I think that's probably just the way that they were actually unweighting, either a timing thing or whatever. But do you want to touch on that really briefly, Daniel, and then we can keep going through the questions because they're starting to pile up.
Yeah, no problem. I think that's a great question. I think you already nailed down some of the things that I was gonna target. But really, I think that there's much more that goes on than just this that we have to consider. I mean, this is a youth athlete, and he's a fairly, I would say he's kind of an anomaly when it comes to the age and the way that he can perform, how fast and strong this guy is. But I think that, we do peak height velocity, so we see where they are in their growth spurts, and there's a lot of variables that we look at with their GPS when they're out on the field, and what type of training theme they have that day, through the week, what the loads are looking like in the gym, what the loads are looking like, what are the prescriptions, how are all those things coming together. I think really it's the more tests we get, the better. So we're looking at that athlete over time. We're looking at that athlete's group, so positional over that time or throughout a certain amount of time. Sometimes that changes because they're obviously younger. They might be playing multiple positions. We're also, I think it just comes down to, as I think you mentioned, Eric, we want to be smart about how we're developing player profiles. And like you said, Ben, we want to be careful about how much we're looking at all these metrics and trying to pull everything in and saying this, that, and that, and that, because then we could get easily lost. So really for us, we're focusing on a couple main metrics and then seeing how those are being influenced over time with all the training variables we're looking at. And then we're of course considering stress is stress. So how well are they sleeping? How long is the drive to training? What's school like? What is I mean, I'm trying to pull anything I can out of my head. There's so many things that you consider. What is the nutrition like? There's so many things to think about. So I think for us, it's really just trying to dial in the training environment, make sure that when they do jump, we have a high level of intent. So we're obviously going to get a better score that way, and we're going to be able to get a better athlete signature. So for us, we also jump twice a week. So every time we see them, the academy kids are in twice a week for the gym. So we'll jump them every time we see them. So we can sort of monitor change at the beginning of the week and the end of the week and look at what those loads are doing. If we have a certain theme in the gym, looking at the themes on the field. So I thought that was a really great question. And I don't think that there's one solid answer. It all depends on where we are and what they're doing and everything else going on in life. Now I have to worry about staying indoors. I mean, anything can hit you at any time. So
I think if I can jump in a little bit, I think Daniel's right. I think one of the nice things about this system in particular is that we can test often and we can test and get information right away. And so if we're able to mitigate some of the variables that we don't know from other aspects of what's going on in their day and their life, we can, if we can get enough data, which for me, I found very useful because of the speed at which we can test and collect the data, we can eventually start to see what's impacting these variables. So if I'm looking at different relationships within that tracing there that we're looking at here on the slide, that unweighting, braking, and for me, I look at what I call a switch phase, which is the phase between the braking and the propulsive. And then that propulsive phase, if I'm looking at all those different variables and I'm looking at how those variables, the relationship between those variables and how they're impacting my athlete, I can go back and if I have enough data, I'm able to understand what is average or what is something that I should be worried about or not worried about in terms of meaningful change. So I think looking at that data and being able to collect it regularly has been super impactful for us, because it's given us a wide enough database to really make decisions on quickly. And again, when it comes to programming and trying to be as efficient as we can with the goals of our athletes, we have to have that information and have it quickly, so that as soon as that athlete's done jumping, those 6 or 7 things that I'm considering while he's jumping, I can go through and make those changes right away. Just like, if I'm reading a defense, I'm a quarterback, and there's some, the coverage changes, I need to have an audible in play to make a call there, and I need to make that change happen quickly so I can be as efficient as I can with the time that I have with our athletes. So, not to take over that question, Daniel, but I just wanted to add on that was a very good point you made.
No, yeah, just to close it off, I think that we don't try to create change for the sake of change, and we don't want to have to force the athlete to do something differently or to jump differently, to have a different strategy just for the sake of getting a different type of signature. We want to see what our training response is providing them. So that's what we're going to see over time here. And what we look at, I mean, we can get the information right away. I mean, not only can we see it on the tablet, but it's right up here for the athlete to see the other way in front of them. So we can all see it as it's happening. So if we need to make a change, we can introduce that right away. Because we jump twice a week, there's constant conversations going on with our lead strength and conditioning coaches and our athletic trainers to see if there's anything that needs to be applied differently. And that goes to the coaching staff, that goes to, our support group, as I showed you earlier in the slide, as it needs to.
Nice. Danny, you actually, I forgot to mention this, but specifically, this is a youth athlete, right? And so I've noticed, having done a lot of combines for various events and things like that, looking at, developing athletes who are literally still physically growing, it's a totally different ballgame. And I think that's really important to note. If you're dealing with a 16-year-old kid, male or female, there's serious changes going on with their body, obviously, hormonal changes, but, you're seeing physical growth, right? So they're growing taller, they're putting on weight more easily, et cetera. You will see dramatic changes in short periods of time with youth athletes. And so that's one area where you don't want to get overly sensitive with the numbers. That's a really good point. I think that's also really interesting, because we do have a lot of users that are that have either a minor league or a youth team affiliated, and they're able to track data from when somebody's 18 years old, drafted or whatever the case may be, or a freshman or whatever. They can potentially collect 4 years of data on an athlete as they mature and as they grow. And so, what impact is the training? What impact is just the straight up physiological changes that are taking place? I mean, it's hard to say, but, week to week, month to month, during a training block, for example, you can set up an automatic score for any metric to be compared against the previous month, for example. So, we're trying to build things into the system as best we can to enable that to happen more seamlessly, rather than, the goal for us as a company is to not force users to kind of build their own like massive complex software for determining readiness, for looking at, what worthwhile change, that kind of thing. So, Daniel, the last thing I'm going to say is you need to send over some higher quality images, because these lower 2 jumps are just absolutely abysmal, super low res. So that's my note. All right. So, I'm just kidding. So I have one from Robin here. It says we have about 10 more questions, so hopefully we can get to them all You say you see real changes when athletes in their first time trace return back to training and playing. What therefore should we be pursuing in rehab if some targets are unattainable? When is it safe to integrate, i.e. impulse asymmetries, and what are we comfortable to chase when back playing? Okay, that's a really good question. Protocol wise, I think there can be a really natural progression through which, you know, when is an athlete able to do test A, B, C, or D? Obviously, you know, we don't think people should be doing drop jumps, you know, 2 weeks post ACL or ankle or whatever. I think it's really important to use common sense with that. But also the key for getting really good kind of return to play data is ensuring that you have good baseline data, right? Because if you don't have a quote unquote normal or pre-injury data set, you're just going to be looking at how much change is occurring week to week. We do some stuff in the physical therapy world, which we're doing more and more of, and those are the questions that are really important, right? I have a knee replacement in an elderly patient. What's worthwhile change? What's worthwhile improvement? What is just noise, right? So a lot of that stuff, it can be challenging. Asymmetry is specifically, as I touched on, and as I know you did as well, Daniel, asymmetry is challenging. It's hard. I think the key, and this kind of goes back to the overall sort of comments we've been making, is that, you know, you need to collect consistent data to start to see what is a norm for an individual. I know, like, internally at our company, we test almost every day, so I kind of have an idea of what everybody's asymmetry looks like on average, and they're not even doing max effort jumps, but that is relatively static, assuming nobody gets injured. If somebody has an injury, yeah, it's going to change a little bit. So then we're starting to see, is there some divergence from that sort of mean? Everybody's going to have a little bit of asymmetry, and it's tempting to say, like, oh, 15% asymmetry favoring one limb indicates, you know, a problem. But the reality is that may just be an anomaly. It may be just the way that that person's put together. It may be, you know, you may be able to kind of attribute that to a limb length difference, for example. And then when you're talking about growing athletes, my gosh, there's so many things that go into it. So I think it's dangerous maybe to set hard limits on what is, you know, a target. I think that's my take on it. I don't know if either of you guys want to touch on it really briefly. I want to start moving through the questions a little bit more quickly. And again, if anybody has things they want to follow up on with anybody, feel free to email me at ben@hawkindynamics.com, and I can communicate things. I don't want to flood Eric and Daniel's inboxes with emails, but also I should note we are having an NSCA CEO event on April 5th on Sunday. It's an all-day event that is available. You should definitely check it out. We're still accepting signups. It's all remote, and we're going to be going into a lot more detail with some actual case studies. So some of these questions might be better served to be asked during that event, just because we're limited for time. But Robin, thank you for the question. The next one, in terms of readiness, what are the key metrics from the counter movement jump? And for those key metrics, which ones are backed by injury stats, performance stats, or both? Eric, Daniel, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, so as far as key metrics from the counter movement jump, I mean, I don't know how many you supply to us now, Ben, but yeah, a lot. So I actually have probably about 7 key metrics that I utilize for my decision making, and just generally. That gets more granular as we get into injury situations, and I can touch on that again. But I'm looking at, again, how I break down that force time tracing, and I'm taking some variables from that force time tracing, and I'm looking at their unweighting phase. I'm looking at how they unweight. I'm looking at the braking phase in terms of rate of force development and impulse. I'm looking at the propulsive phases and how that athlete's, the duration of force that they're producing and the amount of force they're producing. I also look at stiffness and an impulse ratio. For me, those provide a lot of context to the strategy that I'm observing with the force tracing. So, when I look at those variables, and again, those are just a few that I look at, I can get a better understanding as to what's happening in terms of their performance and how they're either changing or maintaining or getting worse in some cases. And then from an the injury perspective, I think we've been able to, obviously we have access to all of our athlete injury data, and I've gotten, over the past, 10 years of working in the NHL, I've been able to understand what athletes' force profiles looked like. And, going back through the injury data, we started to be able to identify, emerging trends in injury if we saw changes in their force patterns happen and their strategy of movement change. And, those injuries could be muscular, they could be musculotendinous, they could be more skeletal. And I think those all tie in with some of the different phases of the force tracing, but more importantly, the relationship between those variables. And again, I say that, the asymmetry between the variables is key, and not just left and right, and having a baseline or a bandwidth for each variable in terms of thresholds, but more importantly, thresholds between the variables and how they relate to the other phases of the tracing are super key for not only performance, but for understanding what potential injuries we can mitigate by training.
Sweet. Next question. I just have an example up here just as a reference. We have a lot of metrics. So this is a 60-something metrics. We highly recommend people focus on 5 to 6, if not even fewer, that they can really get their head around when they start testing. If you're starting a new testing program and you're just working with force plates for the first time, highly recommend limiting what you actually look at, because of what both these guys have said is time, right? Efficiency. It's everything. It's everything for coaches. You don't have 45 minutes to go through each test, to go through each testing session. So the goal is to make things as quick and easy while you're testing. And if you have to sort through 60 things like I'm doing here, it can get a little hectic. We just have a really simple way of deselecting and deactivating metrics and then adding them as we want. And we're working on as well. Like one of the key things I think here is like, what is average braking power? Like defining some of the stuff in the system. Eric, you really said something interesting where, you're talking about kind of this common language. And I think that's something we're trying to do with force data in general. One of the issues anybody here is going to see when they start looking at some of the papers, and Jason loves this because Jason's doing a review on this right now, but not only are things with different softwares with different methodologies calculated differently, sometimes incorrectly, sometimes sort of correct, but they're also named totally different things. So if you're not using our system, something I describe as propulsive force, it could be named something completely different in your software. And I think that's something of a problem because it can get very confusing. We're really trying to move towards more of a standardized approach to the naming of things. So that's something that is definitely worth noting and just being aware of. There's a lot of information out there. Not all of it is correct or good. I like to think our stuff is correct and good, but and it is obviously everything we do, we try to base on solid research. We're not creating metrics out of thin air just because we can. But yeah, so the next question is, for team-based athletes, when analyzing the waveform counter movement jump, what is your go-to metric for monitoring and improvement purposes? So again, another good question, John. Thank you for asking. Eric, if you had to pick one metric, what would you look at for monitoring, just to look at kind of over time?
I would, for monitoring, and I'm thinking, when I talk about monitoring, I'm thinking readiness. I would look at stiffness, and then from a performance perspective, I'm looking at impulse ratio. Those are my two.
Nice. Daniel? Unmute.
Unmute. For me, really, I'm looking at braking, because I think that's highly neural, and then I'm looking at stiffness, and then those other two that Eric mentioned, those are certainly the impulse ratio. That's certainly behind the curtain. We look at that as well.
Nice. All right, next question is from Scott. Daniel's thoughts, rationale behind monitoring braking metrics. That's perfect tie-in from what you literally just said. Are RFD and net impulse. Have you compared these to any sport-specific metrics? Do any relationships exist? So just looking at the braking phase in general, it's a primarily eccentric phase. That's the primary contraction that's going on. It's physically, and if anybody isn't aware, it's literally when the athlete is applying the brakes on the way down, so that this point here where it goes from red to green, it's actually the lowest displacement. That's when you're literally at the bottom of the jump. So the braking phase is the second half of the fall, quote unquote. When you unweight, you're literally in free fall, you apply the brakes, contraction is occurring, and that's where, at least I have seen, and you know, I'll let Daniel talk on this if he wants. A lot of asymmetries will kind of appear there that may not appear during the propulsive phase, because it's almost more of an involuntary contraction. It's almost more of a reaction rather than a deliberate propulsive. You know, the propulsive phase is from the bottom of the jump until you leave the plates. It's a lot easier to sort of mask things there and try to compensate. Whereas during the eccentric or the unweighting and braking phases, I mean braking phases, not unweighting, you can start to see, you might see a higher asymmetry. That's often what we end up seeing.
I mean, it's a really good question if you're thinking about sport-specific metrics. I mean, for us, I mean, I guess for me / for us, if we're looking at something that's sport-specific, I mean, I'm just looking at how certain characteristics are familiar on the field. So if a lot of things we're doing is short and sharp, there's going to be obviously a lot more braking in there, but there needs to be smoothness as well when they're getting out of a turn, out of a hole. So I would assume that's what we mean by net impulse if we're just talking the braking, or if we're looking at the propulsive as well.
Yeah, change of direction, right? Like it's literally that exact phase, right? If how quickly can you plant and push off, right? And you're half of that motion is slowing yourself down if you're moving in a different direction. So the quicker you're able to do that in theory, the better you should be able to do that on the field. But it doesn't always work out that way, right? So another really good test and another good metric to look at is RSI, or modified RSI, because you're measuring in a controlled environment how reactive somebody is, right? How quickly can they land and propel themselves back upwards. And then the drop jump is a really straight up, simple, easy to do, well-studied test for measuring just that. RSI can be cheated a little bit because it looks at flight time and contact time, but modified RSI, which I know Tim, I don't know if Tim's here today, but Tim's a big modified RSI guy. I like modified RSI a lot. We look at the same thing for counter movement jump as well. It's looking at jump height in meters over contact time, right? And so we kind of eliminate that error potential from an RSI value where, you know, an athlete lands in a crouch or something, they're going to get a few milliseconds higher on that flight time. So, you know, we have force plate, we might as well use the more accurate way to measure that jump height.
Yeah, just really quickly, when I keep looking at this question and thinking about it more and more, and I'm obviously focused on that specific area of braking, but then my mind also goes to the other side of things. So if we're looking at, you know, just the propulsive side of things, and even the stiffness piece. So I think that if you're breaking it down sport specific, you can also look at type of positional responses. So if we're talking soccer, I hope I didn't offend anybody by saying soccer, but you know, somebody that might be on the outside and is you know, running back and forth in straight lines a little more often, you might see a little bit less braking. We want to make sure you have that in there depending on how you play, because there might be times where you want to take the opposition on. So you need to have some decent braking, you know, even if you're defending one-on-one. So I think it depends on how you're playing the game, really, how the team is being coached to play the game, what the opposition is like. You're going to see some characteristics based on the position, and you're going to be able to see who is probably going to be who's going to be your quicker player that's going to be able to execute something technically, be able to get in and out of space a lot, you know, more appropriately, probably be able to separate themselves from the opposition if you see better braking and you see a decent amount of stiffness and there's not that sort of that dip in the middle, which we typically see with goalkeepers. But yeah, that question goes deeper than that for me. I mean, you're looking at a lot of different things there. And it's really great over time when you start to put athletes into groups and you're starting to see that these things are real, and you're looking at, you know, the neuromuscular response to their training. And sometimes it's genetic, sometimes it's also taught a little bit too.
Nice. Awesome. All right, next question. Daniel, could you elaborate on what you meant when you refer to the reset phase of the squat data? And that's, I'm just using the data I have here, would be this in-between phase. So this is sort of the preparation for the next squat. So if you think of like a multi-jump, it would be here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So during that phase,
yeah.
So that's literally in between each rep.
Yeah.
Basically
how they're resetting themselves, and if they're resetting like this, as an exaggerated example, are we seeing any difference there? And that could be coming from confidence. It could be coming from hips. So many different things. But usually, if there's some sort of, they're coming back from injury, they're going to favor one side a little more than the other. So if you see a significant difference in the trace there, I would be a little bit concerned, because obviously the reset is like a set. So they're going to be moving they're going to be moving from that position. So, you know, hopefully, you know, they're in a decent position when they start, because they're going to end that way as well, most likely.
Awesome. So next one is from John. During the return to play process, it's a great question. Do you work with sports medicine to track what is being done with the athlete for treatment in combination with what you're doing in strength conditioning to find the best prescription? And Eric, I think you talked a lot. I mean, both of you guys talked a lot about sort of the holistic approach where you're facilitating communication. Yeah,
I can share a screen if you guys want, just show you kind of an example of that.
Sure.
How we do that. Let me see if I can figure out how to do that here.
I think I have to make you the presenter.
Oh, okay. Swap screen. Okay.
So now you should be able to share your screen.
All right. Can you guys see my screen here?
Not yet. You have to. This is the best part. I love these parts. So there's the little share button on the bottom.
Okay, gotcha. All right. Let's see.
Tension's killing me. It better be good.
Jason, you want to jump in? Show your screen? No.
No.
Come on.
Because we all know how that goes, don't we?
I'm glad we had a solid practice. We didn't just joke for 10 minutes before. Here.
Oh,
well, Eric, do you want to talk about it, and then you can maybe send me something and I can throw it up?
Yeah, I can send it to you.
Okay.
Yeah, so to answer that question, yeah, we do have a return to play / end stage return to play performance clearance, and it's basically broken up into different phases. So phase 1, obviously for us, is the medical clearance phase, and that's really focused on the acute phase of the return to sport for the athlete. So they have to go through specific medical clearance with the physician and our athletic training staff. And then once they get to that point, it's all documented. And then there's some subjective markers that they have to work through. Once they get through that phase, they can go into what we call our quality phase, which is going to blend the specific landmarks and metrics that our athletic trainers focus on, some subjective reporting, and then for us, our objective clearances through some of our baseline testing, including force plate analyses. Once they've shown that they're able to not only hit the objective landmarks and variables that our athletic training staff are asking them to improve on, they also need to show improvement in some of the force plate baselines. Once they do that, we're progressing them into what we call our quantity phase, which is usually our end stage return to play. That's going to be really where we get them back to returning to non-contact practices. And then through that end stage return to play, we're also adding in different tests that we're going through with our athletic trainers, our skill coaches on ice, and then off ice, we're going through tests as well. So we look at 3 categories. One is situational, how they're actually engaging with the sport during on ice practices, and how our mechanical measurements are improving through force plate analyses and velocity of movement off the ice. And then a physiological component that we're looking at both on and off ice. We have to make sure that they're metabolically ready to return to play, so that we can provide the athlete athletic training and coaching and general manager all with basically a percentage of how well this athlete is going to perform based off of their baseline. So at the end of this whole return to play, window, the athlete, myself, athletic trainer, all sign our checklist. It gets presented to the general manager and the coach, and then it's up to the coach and general manager to decide if this athlete is going to be put back into the lineup. I'll send that to Ben and he can share it with you guys.
Sorry about that. We all have challenges sometimes. So next question is, in practice, if you have an athlete with a high level asymmetry in a counter movement jump, what interventions would you introduce to combat that? I think the key is you may not want to combat that because asymmetries aren't always an indication of dysfunction. However, if you're talking specifically in a return to play, you're probably just looking at recovery time, right? I mean, Eric,
I think you have to, I think you have to understand what is the average bandwidth for each individual, and then you're going to be able to make a better informed decision on what your next move is going to be, whether you're trying to reduce that asymmetry or not. Because, in sports like mine, our athletes have an inherent asymmetry that makes them successful at their sport. And I think if I was to try to reduce that asymmetry just so I can say everyone is as close to zero as possible, I'm probably going to do 2 things. I'm probably going to make that athlete perform less efficiently, and I'm probably going to put them at a higher risk for injury because they've developed this natural asymmetry. So I think it's important to understand what their averages are in terms of bandwidth, and really find what I guess is for you and your group, what is acceptable for that asymmetry. And I think that's an important thing to consider when you're deciding how much you're going to impact asymmetry left and right. And I think that's an important, certainly an important component to force profiling.
Awesome.
For me, really, can you guys hear me? For me, we actually have an athlete that we saw pretty significant difference in asymmetries, and it was sort of odd because he's performing just fine, and just like anybody, there's always some management that needs to happen there. History of maybe whatever has happened that we continue to work on and continue to improve, but it was pretty significant. We couldn't get much to really change on it, and then we assessed leg length difference, and okay, all right. So this is, to Eric's point, like this is something, and yours as well, Ben, this is just something that's normal, natural. So the best thing you can do is really just keep them strong, keep them moving well, keep them healthy, keep them confident. And, now that we're aware of it, that really changes our approach to training, thinking that something's really, really wrong here. And just more so just taking it in I guess, one step at a time, just keeping an eye on it. And if there's any significant change off of that, then maybe we know there's a problem. But
you're not lengthening the limbs or anything like that, Daniel?
No, we're not pulling one side more than the other before he jumps, or putting in a heel lift before he jumps, anything like that.
Nice.
One weightlifting shoe on one side.
Perfect. All right. So next one from Ross, just curious about readiness testing and injury. Is there any evidence of negative changes in data seen across time and linked to chronic injury development? Do these allow to create thresholds for us to create thresholds for meaningful decrements, i.e. when to pull an athlete, change loading? It's a really, really good question. Does anybody have a good example of that from an athlete who you started to see sort of a decline or a slip beyond just what you would expect if somebody's falling out of shape or getting older?
Yeah, I mean, I think I experienced this quite often with detraining. I think one of the big things that I have to consider in my environment is how often we play and how often we travel. And one of the things that I consider is what's going to happen to our athletes if we don't focus on something specific in terms of training based off of the force plate data that we're able to collect regularly. And if I allow that window to occur, can I be confident that we're not going to see an injury happen? So I think we've seen over time, based off of going on a 2-week road trip and having limited training, not only time but access to equipment, that we've seen athletes in those 2 weeks lose training effect and therefore lose capacity in some of the variables that are important to them. And what happened there was that we saw athletes not only perform probably a little bit less effectively, but we saw guys start to get banged up. And I think that's been a big key for me in understanding how I was going to modify my programming and interventions and my ideologies around periodization. Because if I train an athlete through all eccentric type of training to improve braking abilities when I'm at home, I don't have that ability on the road. So I had to be better at making my program more adaptable. And through that, I had to understand how to dose my programming better to make sure I was able to keep those variables at a level that was, for me, adequate enough to not lose training effect over a 2-week span where we played, maybe 8 or 9 games in 2 weeks. And so I think that I've definitely seen that, and it's certainly not uncommon. I think people that say that that is uncommon might be giving you the runaround. So I would certainly say that it's an important variable to consider, that if you're not able to understand what variables you're training for, that you're really not going to be able to see those potential emerging patterns. So it's certainly important for me.
Nice. So we have, I want to kind of wrap things up in the next couple minutes, and I apologize to the questions that we haven't gotten a chance to answer. We're going to be holding another webinar, I believe, next week, same potentially the same time slot. Just gotta have to see what's realistic for everybody we want to bring on. But so far, this has been awesome. If some of these questions are actually answered in some of the questions that we haven't gotten to are actually answered in our previous webinars from the last couple of weeks, I would highly recommend anybody interested to check those out. They're on our YouTube channel. This one will be uploaded as well tonight. As soon as Zoom processes it. I think there's a little bit of a system overload on Zoom right now, given how many people are working remotely. So things seem to be taking a little bit longer. However, everybody should get an announcement when it's available. Other than that, just want to thank Eric and Daniel for joining us today, and just giving you guys a little bit of a taste of the type of thing that we're going to be offering more regularly, and also really just trying to facilitate better communication in the industry. And if we can facilitate that as a company, that's a win for us. We really just want to get people talking and starting to understand this stuff. Our whole company philosophy is around demystifying force plates, right? Because I think a lot of times, and both Eric and Daniel kind of touched on this in their own way, but people tend to overcomplicate things. That's just human nature, I'd say. And I think in this case, the key takeaway I would want is folks to understand that, there's a lot of different ways to do this. Some of them are more effective than others, but at the end of the day, working within your own system, wherever you are, whatever sport you're in, there's going to be sport specific stuff. There's going to be a lot of variables here. At the end of the day, if you build a solid foundation in your testing program, you're going to be able to do a lot with the information that you collect. So our thing as a company is we want to facilitate that. We want to enable that for users, just to make the process simple. Jason really did a really good job the other day, last week, in talking about a couple of key metrics to start looking at, right? And he has a really good blog post going up. I believe it's going out today, talking about some of this stuff. So definitely check out our blog, check out our YouTube channel. This is where I'm supposed to tell everybody to hit subscribe and all that stuff. I'm not really I'm a true millennial, early millennial, so I'm not really up to all of the streaming lingo, but we have a couple folks in our company that have been trying to trying to get me up to speed. I actually, I'm learning. So Eric as well. I know Eric's a weathered old man now. But yeah, really appreciate everybody attending. And again, we're really trying to promote more education, information sharing. But at the same time, you know, we are offering a program, NSCA approved CEUs on April 5th. If anybody really wants to spend a day, get access to the downloads, the materials, and really get deep into some specific case studies, that's what we're going to be offering. And I think that is the sort of the next level of what we're talking about here. We don't want to get too sort of in deep on this stuff just because of the time considerations, because I'll be honest, we could probably go for the next 2 hours. If anybody wants a demo of our software, we could do that via Zoom as well. Happy to do that at any time. We do it all the time, and you know, we have force plates in stock, so if anybody's interested in buying force plates from us, just reach out to me. I feel like I'm obligated to make that pitch here at the end. Daniel, Eric, you guys want to add anything? Jason?
I would say thanks, Ben. Thanks for letting us do this sort of thing.
Of course.
I mean, for me, this is great. And I love the discussion most of all. You know, I think the information is good, but then you really start to dial things in more and just come up with some good talks.
Yeah, I think it's a really awesome opportunity, not only to learn from the other panelists, but also to share. I think everybody on this panel is really, their main focus is getting better. So if there's questions that, you know, we're hoping to get answered that didn't, I mean, I'm free to, you know, be reached out to. And I am presenting at the event in April. So, you know, be on the lookout for some of the information I talked about today to be talked about in more, with more depth and more detail. I'm just going to be sharing how we formulate those models and create our force profiles and with more detail. So thanks for the opportunity, Ben.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. Both Daniel and Eric are part of our event in April. Again, you do get one CEU from the NSCA. Should also put in a plug for our Coaches versus COVID-19 webinar series that's happening in a couple of weeks. Lots of webinars, so I hope nobody's burned out from this, but it's a really great event. We're going to be, we've already raised a lot of money, and we're organizing it with, I should mention, Drake, who's on our panel right now. I'm not sure if he is still here, but put a lot of effort into it over the last couple of weeks. We're really trying to raise a significant amount of money for folks who are impacted by the pandemic. Obviously, it's a really big deal, and it's impacting a lot of people. And we just want to try to do something positive. And so we've got a lineup of really awesome speakers. It's being led off by Mr. Renaghan himself. And I failed to introduce both these guys, and I should have, but Eric's the head of performance of the St. Louis Blues, who you may know are the current Stanley Cup champions. And Daniel, what is your actual official title? Because I know it's changed slightly. I don't want to get it wrong.
Yeah, I get it wrong all the time too. Head of athletic performance
at
the San Jose Earthquakes.
Right, MLS.
It's an MLS team.
Yeah. That is soccer, also known as football.
Major League Football.
Yeah. Right. Major League Football. Sure. Whatever you say. Unfortunately, Peter couldn't join us. I know he had a doctor's appointment, but we're going to try to get him on in the next couple of weeks to provide some of his wonderful language and his beautiful Manchester accent. And if nobody knows, Peter is a co-founder of this company and really core to what we do, and really helped us build this thing out in the beginning. He was here, I think, 3 years ago in Vegas, and is an overall awesome guy, and is going through some serious medical stuff right now. So just want to give him a shout out. Hopefully he'll be able to join us for the next one. But yeah, I don't know if I'm forgetting anything. Drake, do you want to chime in or no? That's a no. I don't know if yes is mic connected. But yeah, so again, the Coaches versus COVID conference is going to be a 4-day event. We may be adding more to it, and we also may be extending it. We're raising money. It's all donation based. We're not profiting a dime off this. companies are donating $1,000 to the cause. We've already gotten a ton of really great companies pitching in, so it's looking to be a really, really great program. I encourage everybody here, if you've got the time, join up. Hopefully we'll be able to get those videos up online in the weeks after the event. But so far we're approaching 1,000 attendees, so it's going to be really good. Today we had about 110 on this webinar today, which is awesome. And again, just want to reiterate for the last time, if you have further questions, if you want to talk about this stuff, feel free to reach out to me directly. My email is ben@hawkindynamics.com. And yeah, we love this stuff, so you're never bothering with questions, even if they seem obvious or something like that. But yeah, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and keep an eye out for we'll send everybody who's joined an email to let you know what the next topic is going to be next week. I think we might be doing something around the isometric mid-thigh pull, more test specific, because it's a really useful tool. And we can get really kind of a little bit more deep with that. I know that we have some heavy hitters potentially talking about some really interesting research into that particular test, and that would be definitely an event worth attending. So thanks to everybody. We're going to wrap it up and see you next time. Yeah, that's, I think, it.
Definitely. Cheers, Ben.
All right, thanks guys. Thanks to everybody for joining. Looking forward to the next one. Eric, you may need to end the meeting because I think you're the
Okay.
yeah.